Hey, this is Joel. Welcome back to the channel, and let's do a little bit of critiquing creationism. Just going to a social media post by Answers in Genesis, and it's reading these little bits that get me. Well, it's really mostly reading the comments that get me going and get me thinking. But sometimes I wonder, does Answers in Genesis think through what they write? They write these very vague, wonderful sounding statements, I think, to their audience. But what do they really mean? I find these things to be very vacuous at times. Joel? What are you talking about? Let's talk about this particular um, post. Because of Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden, we all live in a fallen, cursed world and share the consequences. Right? This is the big concept for Answers in Genesis and all young earth creationists, is that Adam's sin isn't just affecting human beings or he and Eve and his offspring, but it's actually the consequences across the entire world. And not even just the whole world, but most young earth creationists would say the entire universe has been shaken, altered, like the physical uh, rules by which the universe operates have actually changed as a result of Adam disobeying the command of God. But this particular post is honed in on one particular thing, one particular consequence, and that is natural disasters are part of that curse. It's pretty commonplace for younger creationists to bemoan or talk about, when some natural disaster happens, some large disaster like huge tsunami in Indonesia or in Japan, or massive earthquake strikes, right? Puerto Rico or something, or a hurricane, right? These are natural disasters, and we want to pin that on that's Adam's fault, right? Adam caused that. If Adam hadn't sinned, we wouldn't have an earthquake. We wouldn't have that volcano. We wouldn't have that tsunami. We wouldn't have that hurricane. Right. So, but what exactly is meant by this? What are natural disasters? See, they see natural disasters as earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, not just as merely random outcomes of physical processes, but as manifestations of the curse that followed the fall. That is, these disasters are interpreted as maybe abnormal or excessive expressions of natural processes, because after all, processes are occurring, right? I mean, water is running, air is flowing, the sunlight is beaming, all these things are happening, like things are in motion, right? So processes are occurring. So what is a natural disaster then? Somehow that is an abnormal or maybe excessive expression of what are normal natural processes, or maybe like in the pre-fall environment, they would have been more benign, like we could completely predict everything that would happen, or that maybe there is a force, like maybe God is preventing accidents from happening. Like, these are all, the accidents were possible in the sense of like they could be caused by natural processes, but somehow God is like, oh, wait a second, that thing is falling. Like, for example, tree continues to grow, right? In the garden, well, and for young earth creation, it's really the whole earth. Plants are growing, and they don't stop growing. I mean, they're filling the earth, and so they get really large. Would any of them fall down? Would any tree have ever fallen down? Right? Would that constitute death? If that's a natural process of it falling down and decaying, and there are young earth creationists who think that like plants aren't really alive, they're part of a process in the world. Like we eat fruit, right? We eat leaves. We're consuming plant material presumably before Adam's sin, and therefore it can be recycled. The chemistry of that can be reconfigured, right? You're breaking bonds, and then you're giving off carbon dioxide and water, and then they can become sugar again inside of plants. And so natural processes are occurring. But what about a tree? When a tree falls? What if the tree is falling and it looks like it's going to land on a canine over there? All right, but the canine can't die. All right, because there's no death for life, whatever life is. So let's not go down that rabbit trail right now. But so it's falling toward that canine, but it can't actually land on it and kill it, right? So either it has to be guided away, or make sure that or maybe God is directing it to fall at a time when the canine is not passing by. It's going to get super complicated when you start thinking about like What exactly is a natural disaster? Like how big of a thing has to happen for it to be a natural disaster? Trees falling down? Seeds falling off of trees and clonking you on the head? Is that a natural disaster? I mean, it is a natural process, right? And that coconut, falling off the tree and then hitting you on the head could cause you some pain, right? I mean, it wouldn't kill you, presumably, but it could hurt you, right? Could I not twist my ankle in the Garden of Eden? Could I not break a leg? Could water not overrun its bank and like cover up a bunch of grass with mud? Would that be a disaster? Or you say like, no, that's just kind of normal. That's not really that big of a deal. I mean, you could have a massive flood, and if nobody gets killed, is that then not a natural disaster? But if it impacts how we're like living, like it takes away other resources, so now like all my fruit trees are dead because of this flood, is that a natural disaster? Is that something that is that the curse causes? Or put it another way, is that something that couldn't have happened in the fall, before the fall? Couldn't have had floods, couldn't have had wind more than 5 miles an hour, right? Couldn't have had like, gamma bursts. You couldn't have comets flying through space and hitting one another, right? Is that a disaster? Again, there's no definition of what a natural disaster is. How do you demarcate a natural disaster? Is it all relative to us? Or is a natural disaster relative to other organisms if it kills other types of organisms? Tricky. But I do have one other reason why I brought this up. So I'm asking these questions, especially from a geological perspective, because I remember there's this article here this is way back in 2013, but is the Bible silent on geological events? This is a question asked of Andrew Snelling, the geologist, primary geologist at Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham's organization. So he writes an article, examples of massive geological events in the Bible, like massive, massive events. The creation of the earth by God was a stupendous geological event. 2 days after he created the earth, so on the second day of creation, God said, let the waters on the heavens be gathered together into one place and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and he gathered together the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was all good, right? Genesis 1, 9 through 10. I believe, this is Andrew Snelling speaking, I believe that God gathered the waters on Earth's surface into ocean basins, uplifted rocks to form a supercontinent. They believe in one single continent. So the water was covered with water, Earth was covered with water, and then this huge continent gets lifted up and a land surface, and he put soil and created plants to clothe it. All right, so on the next day of creation, he puts soil there. Now, I don't know if he means like God snapped his fingers and there was soil. It's a little bit of a weird thing to think about, right? It's like, well, in the first day, the supercontinents were uplifted. This rock was pushed up. Right? In other words, he's appealing to some kind of natural progression, right? Some kind of like physical forces that are obeying some sort of rules that are making this, supercontinent. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, once the supercontinent's there, then he put soil there. Put more sounds like not develops soil through a process, but there shall be soil, and soil appears. Except that that's not actually in the Bible, right? It doesn't say that. It does say that created the plants, but doesn't actually say there shall be plants. He says, well, he does say he speaks the word and says there'll be plants. And then the response is, and from the ground, came forth plants. Again, sort of, evoking the idea of there's a process to develop those plants. It's not instantaneous creation, but gets a little better. And then in just a sentence or two, what has God done? God describes another earth-altering geological event to form and raise a supercontinent landmass from above the globe-encircling waters required catastrophic earth movements. Snelling is saying, and yes, heck yes, You got the entire earth, it's covered with water. In the space of 24 hours, you're going to lift an entire supercontinent out of the water, drain the water off, and erode a bunch of stuff in 24 hours? That is a cataclysmic, catastrophic event. It sure sounds like a natural disaster, doesn't it? All right. Now, that's a disaster that was deemed by God to be like what God is commanding to happen. What makes it not a natural disaster, I think, in young earth creationist mind is that humans weren't there. See, it's relative to humans, right? Humans weren't hurt by this. And so therefore that can happen. Well, I said, if that can happen, then why can't planets collide with each other before Adam's sin? Because I hear all the time, like, it's because of Adam's sin that, that the planets aren't, comets were created, and like there's bad things that happen out there in the universe. Things are bumping into there, stars are exploding. Like all the things are considered to be disasters out in space, but they don't affect me. I don't care if over there in planet X, 3 billion light years away, that one of its planets bumps into another planet and has like a massive disaster, right? A massive change. Right? Somehow that is the result of Adam's sin. But here we have Andrew Snelling admitting that a massive event occurs. It's a catastrophic thing that happens, that if you or I were standing in this place at this time, we would certainly succumb to it, right? Right? As the emerging supercontinent breached the waters, the latter would have drained off, scouring the emerging land surface. He's trying to explain why there's like thousands of feet of sediments from, the early Earth, which doesn't have any fossils in it. The erosion would change those retreating waters with sediments, which would then have been deposited in mass surrounding the supercontinent and spreading out onto the ocean floor. So part of the base level of the basement level of the oceanic crust is being formed at this time. Wow. Those sure sound like natural disasters to me. But these are not the result of sin, are they? They can't be. I mean, Adam comes later, right? So Adam's fall and the curse in particular that causes the beginnings of natural disasters hasn't happened yet. So I really don't understand the nuances. There aren't any nuances, with young earth creationists, but so I don't understand what constitutes. I don't need a definition of what constitutes a natural disaster versus this is not a natural disaster. I mean, it was really windy, and my bamboo. Well, actually, better example. I had an ice storm. And the ice right outside my window here on a very large patch of bamboo in my neighbor's yard caused the bamboo to bend over via the weight of the ice on it. Literally bent over all the way till it touched the ground and then froze to my driveway, which goes right by the bamboo. And I was essentially trapped in my house. Trapped in the sense I couldn't get my cars out from behind the house to go out to the street because the bamboo was so thick there. Is that a natural disaster? The inconvenience to me of not being able to leave my home for a day? Or would only have been a disaster if the same ice had bent over onto the power line and broke the power line, and therefore I was extremely cold. But that couldn't have possibly happened before Adam's fall, because that is a natural disaster. Right, that's not something that just happens on an average day. Of course, I guess there wouldn't have been ice before the fall. And you see, I could sit here and talk about this all day long. We can just go through all kinds of different examples and ask ourselves, what about what just happened is something that couldn't have happened in God's original creation? Like you're saying, like it couldn't have happened in the garden, but you're saying it couldn't happen anywhere on earth. Right? You couldn't have had an ice fall. You couldn't, because, hey, if you did have ice, I mean, the ice could have broken off and fallen on an organism and damaged it and killed it. So better to just prevent any ice from forming to begin with in order to protect those organisms. Like, all this stuff about what the fall is like just really doesn't make a lot of sense. A pre-fall world being somehow a completely different um, the rules all being different. Because then Adam and Eve are not relatable to us. They're like, okay, God made humans, but they made them in such a different way that you and we just cannot even understand them, right? They can't die. So, but could they twist their ankle? Could they feel pain? Did they get tooth decay? Most creationists are kind of like on the nope, they wouldn't have experienced even, discomfort really. Everything was just hunky dory all the time. So I'm like, all right, so, what if I get to the edge of a 10-foot, I'm climbing a tree, right? I'm climbing a coconut tree and to get some coconuts, and I fall out of the tree and nothing happens to me. I just land on the ground. I'm like, yeah, that was awesome. Right. That was pretty fun falling. Actually, it felt pretty good. Like it's like weightlessness. It's kind of a really interesting phenomena to feel weightless. Right. I think I'm going to go do that again because that was like a fun ride. Right. And you can do it again because you're not going to get hurt. Right. Nothing can happen to you. Like we can't relate to that. Right. How could you fall out of that tree 20 feet and not be hurt at all? That means your cells operate differently. It means your pain receptors your bones are different. Like everything is different. Or is everything exactly the same except God is specially like somehow miraculously, healing everything at every moment. So that, the bone broke, but I never knew it because God just healed it right away. I mean, you get in all these wild scenarios. But I would still say like, okay, so you fell off a tree and it didn't hurt you. So that means, that means I can jump off a 100-foot cliff, right? I was like, would you know that you can't do something because it could hurt you? Because everything you ever had before never hurt you. So of course you're going to jump off a 100-foot cliff. You're like, hey, I want to get down there at the bottom of that ravine. I'm just going to roll down there. I'm going to throw my body out there because I'm not going to get hurt. I see this doesn't make sense. And it's like, why would any creature, I'm sorry, I'm still going on here. These are things I've talked about before, but why would any creature need any particular features? They don't need a coat of a certain length. They don't need eyes. They're able to see a certain distance. They don't need sharp teeth. They could survive no matter what characteristics they had. They could have all kinds of crazy characteristics. You think about the organisms alive today as they're super efficient and they're adapted for particular locations and times and environments. Totally adapted those environments. Adaptation would, to me, mean nothing if there's no possibility of death, no possibility of being hurt. Then your characteristics really don't, they're not there for helping you to survive in that environment because they're not necessary. Okay, and this is where maybe young earth creationists fall back on this idea of, hey, God already knew that the fall was going to happen and he knew that death was going to come into the world. So he gave them these different properties to be able to live in that future world. So that's why prey organisms have eyes that are on the sides of their heads like rabbits. But if you're a carnivore, you have eyes that are more forward focused, right? And you have stereoscopic vision, right? So in the garden, meaningless, doesn't matter. Eyes on the side of your head, front of head, one eye on one side, one eye on the front. I mean, it kind of doesn't matter. You got some field of view. But for the holistic adaptation of that organism to a predator-prey relationship, those characteristics matter a lot. And so they're like pre-made for the future. All right, so I got kind of far afield from the disaster thing. But, did Adam and Eve have free will to just jump off a cliff or jump out of a tree and the consequences were nothing? They didn't have to worry about this consequence. The only consequence they had to worry about was obeying a rule about which fruit to eat. All right, so there was no volcanism. Was there no plate tectonics? Or is the idea here there was plate tectonics, but at a very, earthquakes were all 1.0 on the Richter scale or less, because that wouldn't have hurt anybody. And so therefore that's not a disaster. All right. So when Adam sinned, suddenly the plate started moving faster or moving in slow, jerky motions, right? Didn't move, then moved, then moved, didn't move, and then moved. And that caused like larger earthquakes. Was there no lightning from storms? And if there was lightning, how was, it prevented from hurting anything? No floods? If were streams always running at the same amount of water all the time, right? Because if the stream goes higher, faster, or slower, that's going to cause erosion. Eventually, it's going to flow over out of its. It's just you go down every single thing, natural phenomena you think of, and where's the demarcation between this is the way it worked and functioned before the fall, and then here is after the fall. Here's what it's doing. I've never seen a very clear, like any young earth creationist really try to grapple with this in any kind of like systematic way. All right. And that's me rambling about a single social media post. We live in a cursed world and we share the consequences with the rest of the world for that sin of Adam. Natural disasters are part of that curse. And I get it. This is a way to kind of like try to solve the question of like, why did all those people die from, that airplane crash? How could those bad things happen? And the easiest thing to do is just blame Adam and say, well, wouldn't have happened. Wouldn't have happened if Adam hadn't sinned. All right. It's kind of like the easy escape route. But just exactly what wouldn't have happened? All right. I got to stop. Thanks for hanging out. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.